Judge Harrison Blackwood adjusted his silk tie as he strode into the opulent chambers of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of absolute authority. At 58, he commanded respect through fear rather than admiration, his reputation built on harsh sentences and an unwavering belief in his own superiority. His net worth exceeded $40 million, accumulated through decades of strategic investments and what he considered shrewd financial planning. The morning's case involved a complex international fraud scheme with documents in multiple languages, requiring the services of a certified translator. Blackwood barely glanced at the woman sitting quietly in the corner of his chambers as his clerk briefed him on the proceedings. She appeared unremarkable. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a simple gray suit that suggested competence rather than affluence. "Your Honor," his clerk said nervously, "this is Dr. Maria Santos, the court-appointed translator for the Kozlov case. She speaks 7 languages and has 30 years of experience in legal translation." Blackwood waved dismissively without looking up from his papers. Fine. Let's get this circus started. I have a golf appointment at 2. The courtroom filled quickly with attorneys, defendants, witnesses, and observers. Viktor Kozlov, a Russian businessman accused of embezzling $12 million through shell companies, sat flanked by his expensive legal team. The prosecution had spent months building their case, but the key evidence was contained in documents written in Russian, Spanish, and Portuguese, languages that required expert translation to present to the jury. As Dr. Santos took her position near the witness stand, Blackwood noticed something that made him pause. When she turned to adjust her microphone, he caught a glimpse of her profile, and a cold dread began forming in the pit of his stomach. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. The lead prosecutor began presenting the first set of documents. "Dr. Santos, please translate this email correspondence between the defendant and his associate in Moscow." Maria's voice was clear and professional as she translated the Russian text, her words painting a picture of deliberate financial manipulation. Blackwood found himself studying her more intently, that nagging sense of recognition growing stronger with each passing minute. The defendant writes, "Transfer the funds through the Cayman account as discussed. Make sure the paperwork shows legitimate consulting fees." His associate responds, "Understood. The shell companies are established and ready." Kozlov's defense attorney objected repeatedly, claiming the translations were biased or inaccurate, but Maria calmly provided alternative phrasings that conveyed the same damning meaning. Her expertise was evident, her translations precise and damaging to the defense. During a brief recess, Blackwood's unease transformed into genuine alarm as a memory surfaced from 15 years ago. Maria Santos. Dr. Maria Santos, who had worked as a translator for the immigration court when he was a district judge, the same Maria Santos whose younger brother had appeared before his bench, seeking asylum from political persecution in Colombia. The memory crystallized with sickening clarity. Miguel Santos, 19 years old, barely speaking English, pleading through his sister's translation for protection from death threats he'd received after witnessing a massacre by paramilitary forces. Blackwood had been in a particularly foul mood that day, irritated by his wife's demands for a more expensive anniversary gift and pressure from his political backers to appear tough on immigration. He had denied the asylum claim with unusual cruelty, dismissing Miguel's evidence as fabricated and suggesting the young man was simply seeking economic opportunity. Maria had translated her brother's desperate pleas word for word, her professional composure cracking only slightly as tears gathered in her eyes. Blackwood remembered feeling annoyed by her emotional display and had threatened to hold her in contempt if she couldn't maintain objectivity. Miguel Santos had been deported 3 weeks later. According to the news reports that followed, he had been murdered within days of returning to Colombia, found shot execution-style outside his family's village. The human rights organizations had raised questions about the rushed deportation, but Blackwood had weathered the minor controversy and moved on to his federal appointment without consequence. As the trial resumed, Blackwood watched Maria with growing paranoia. Did she remember him? Was her presence here merely coincidence, or had she somehow maneuvered to be assigned to this case? His hands began to sweat as he gripped his gavel, trying to focus on the proceedings while his mind raced through possibilities. The prosecution moved to their most damaging evidence, a recorded phone conversation between Kozlov and his money laundering contact in Brazil. The recording was in Portuguese, And as Maria prepared to translate, Blackwood saw something flash in her eyes that made his blood run cold. "Before we proceed," the defense attorney said, "I'd like to challenge Dr. Santos's qualifications to translate this particular dialect of Portuguese. The recording appears to be from a specific region of Brazil, and I question whether she has sufficient familiarity with local colloquialisms." Blackwood seized on this delay, hoping to buy time to think. "Dr. Santos, please provide the court with your specific credentials regarding Brazilian Portuguese." Maria stood slowly, her gaze meeting his directly for the first time. "Your Honor, I lived in São Paulo for 5 years while researching a doctoral thesis on linguistic variations in legal testimony. I am intimately familiar with both formal legal Portuguese and regional dialects. However, before I proceed with this translation, I have a question for the court." Blackwood felt his throat tighten. "What kind of question?" "I've discovered an irregularity in one of the case files that troubles me professionally. There appears to be a document that has been mistranslated in previous proceedings. As an officer of this court, I feel obligated to bring it to your attention." The prosecutor looked confused. "Your Honor, we haven't provided Dr. Santos with any previously translated materials." Maria reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder. "No, but I recognized a name in the case files and did some research. It concerns a matter from 15 years ago in the immigration court, where crucial testimony was allegedly mistranslated, leading to a wrongful deportation and subsequent death." Blackwood's vision began to blur around the edges. "Dr. Santos, this court is not the appropriate venue for reviewing immigration cases from—" "The name that caught my attention," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger, "was Judge Harrison Blackwood, the same Judge Blackwood who denied asylum to Miguel Santos in 2009, despite clear evidence of credible threats to his life." The courtroom fell silent. Kozlov's attorneys looked bewildered, while the prosecution team exchanged uncertain glances. Blackwood could feel every eye in the room turning toward him. "Dr. Santos," he said, his voice strained, "you are here to translate documents in the Kozlov case, not to relitigate old immigration matters." "You're absolutely right, Your Honor," Maria replied calmly, "which brings me to my professional dilemma. I've been asked to translate this recording honestly and accurately. But I find myself wondering about the reliability of any legal proceeding over which you preside, given your history of allowing mistranslations to stand when they serve your desired outcome." Blackwood's face flushed red. "You are out of order, Dr. Santos. I will hold you in contempt if you continue this line of—" "Miguel Santos spoke perfect Spanish, Your Honor. Not broken Spanish, not street Spanish, but educated, formal Spanish. He was a university student, not an uneducated peasant, as you characterized him. His testimony about the massacre was corroborated by human rights organizations, yet you claimed his account was inconsistent and unreliable." The lead prosecutor half rose from his seat. "Your Honor, I'm not sure what's happening here, but perhaps we should adjourn." "Miguel Santos had witnesses," Maria continued, her composure beginning to crack. "He had documentation. He had everything your court required for asylum, but you had already decided his fate before he spoke a single word. You didn't care about the translation because you weren't listening to the content." Blackwood stood abruptly, his chair sliding backward. "Dr. Santos, you will stop this immediately, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." "Will you?" Maria asked, pulling another document from her folder. "The same way you had my brother removed from the country to face certain death? Or perhaps you'd prefer I simply translate this lie?" She held up a paper that made Blackwood's knees buckle. It was a bank statement from 2009, showing a deposit of $50,000 into his personal account, dated 3 days after Miguel's deportation hearing. "This is a bank record showing payment from Cordero Industries to your personal account," Maria said, her voice now carrying throughout the silent courtroom. Cordero Industries, the same Colombian company that had been threatened by Miguel's testimony about their connections to paramilitary groups. The same company that benefited significantly when the witness to their crimes was conveniently deported. Quote, Blackwood gripped the edge of his bench, his face now completely drained of color. "Where did you get that? Those records are private, confidential." "Obtained through a Freedom of Information request filed by my family's attorney," Maria replied. "It took 15 years, but we finally traced the money. $50,000 to ensure my brother would be silenced permanently." The courtroom erupted as reporters began frantically typing on their phones and tablets. Kozlov's defense team huddled in urgent whispered conference, while the prosecution sat in stunned silence. "You wanted me to translate a lie," Maria said, her voice now shaking with controlled fury. "But the biggest lie in this room isn't in any of these documents. It's the lie that you represent justice. It's the lie that my brother died because of mistranslation rather than deliberate corruption. It's the lie that you wear that robe with honor instead of blood on your hands." Blackwood's voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "You have no proof that I have 15 years of proof," Maria interrupted. "Bank records, travel receipts showing your trip to the Cayman Islands immediately after Miguel's hearing, correspondence between your office and Cordero's legal team, and testimony from 3 other asylum seekers whose cases you decided against after receiving similar payments." The bailiffs had moved closer to the bench, unsure whether to protect the judge or arrest him. The lead prosecutor was now openly staring at Blackwood, with a mixture of shock and disgust. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said carefully, "in light of these allegations, I think it would be appropriate to adjourn this trial until—" "The trial will continue," Blackwood said desperately, sweat now visible on his forehead. "Dr. Santos has clearly exceeded her authority and should be removed for contempt." Maria laughed bitterly. "Contempt? You want to talk about contempt? You held my family in contempt when you sold my brother's life for $50,000. You held justice in contempt when you took bribes to deny legitimate asylum claims. You held this court in contempt every day you sat on that bench knowing you were a murderer." The word murderer hung in the air like a physical presence. Several jurors gasped audibly, while court reporters continued their frantic documentation of the unfolding drama. "I am not a murderer," Blackwood said, his voice cracking. "I made judicial decisions based on the evidence presented." "Evidence you ignored in favor of blood money," Maria shot back. "Miguel had video footage of the massacre. He had sworn statements from other witnesses. He had medical records documenting torture he'd endured before escaping. You dismissed it all because Cordero Industries paid you to ensure their secrets died with my brother." Blackwood looked around the courtroom desperately, seeing his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. 30 years of judicial service, a reputation for tough law and order decisions, his federal appointment, all of it dissolving under the weight of Maria's accusations. "Even if what you're saying were true," he said weakly, "this is not the appropriate forum." "There is no appropriate forum for what you did," Maria replied. "The immigration court where you committed your crimes has no jurisdiction over you anymore. The ethics committee that should have investigated you was headed by your golf partner. The FBI agents who should have pursued the corruption charges were the same ones you played poker with every Thursday night." She turned to address the packed courtroom directly, so I waited. I spent 15 years becoming the best translator in the federal court system. I learned every language I could, earned every credential possible, built a reputation so solid that no one would question my presence in any courtroom in this country. I waited for the day when Judge Harrison Blackwood would need something translated, something important enough that he couldn't refuse my services. The prosecutor found his voice. "Dr. Santos, are you saying you deliberately sought assignment to this case?" "I'm saying I've been assigned to 12 cases in Judge Blackwood's courtroom over the past 3 years," Maria replied. "Each time, I've watched him dispense what he calls justice, knowing that he sits on that bench with my brother's blood on his hands. Each time, I've waited for the right moment, the right case, the right audience to expose the truth." Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This woman is clearly unstable, obsessed with a family grudge." "The bank records are unstable," Maria interrupted. "The FBI investigation that's been reopened based on my evidence is a family grudge? The 3 other families who have come forward with similar stories about your corruption, are they all obsessed?" Quote. The courtroom fell silent as the full implications of her words sank in. Blackwood stared at her in horror, realizing that his nightmare was far from over. "Yes, Your Honor," Maria continued. "The FBI has been investigating your financial records for 6 months. They've been waiting for the right moment to make arrests, and I believe my testimony here today has provided that moment." As if summoned by her words, the courtroom doors opened and 2 FBI agents entered, their badges clearly visible. Behind them came Agent Sarah Chen, whom Blackwood recognized with sinking dread as the head of the Public Corruption Unit. "Judge Blackwood," Agent Chen called out, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." Blackwood's legs gave out, and he collapsed into his chair. The gavel fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the wooden desk with a sound like a gunshot. Around him, the courtroom erupted into chaos as reporters shouted questions and photographers captured every moment of his downfall. Maria watched from her position near the witness stand, her expression calm despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "You asked me to translate a lie," she said, her voice somehow audible above the commotion. "But the truth doesn't need translation. It speaks every language, crosses every border, and waits as long as necessary for justice." As the FBI agents approached the bench to place Blackwood in handcuffs, Maria gathered her papers and walked quietly toward the exit. She had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and now that it had arrived, she felt only a profound exhaustion mixed with relief. Judge Harrison Blackwood, who had once commanded absolute authority in his courtroom, was led away in handcuffs as cameras flashed and reporters documented the fall of one of the most powerful judges in the federal system. The last thing he saw before the courtroom doors closed behind him was Maria Santos standing in the hallway, holding a photograph of a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Miguel Santos, whose death had finally been answered with truth. The Kozlov trial was postponed indefinitely as the legal system grappled with the implications of a federal judge's corruption. But in the small apartment in Queens that night, Maria Santos sat at her kitchen table, writing a letter to her family in Colombia, telling them that Miguel's voice had finally been heard, that his death had finally been acknowledged, and that the man who had silenced him would never sit in judgment of another human being again. "Justice," she wrote, "sometimes takes 15 years to translate, but it always finds the right words in the end." The news of Judge Blackwood's arrest spread through the legal community like wildfire. Within hours, every major network was running footage of the respected federal judge being led away in handcuffs, his reputation in ruins. Legal analysts worked overtime trying to comprehend the scope of the corruption scandal, while immigration attorneys across the country began filing appeals for cases that had been decided in Blackwood's courtroom. Maria returned to her modest apartment in Queens, emotionally drained but strangely at peace. She had spent so many years planning this moment that she hadn't considered what would come after. The silence in her small kitchen felt different now, not empty with grief, but full with the weight of completed purpose. Her phone rang constantly throughout the evening. Reporters wanted interviews. Legal organizations wanted her testimony. Other families affected by Blackwood's decisions wanted her help. But Maria let them all go to voicemail. Tonight belonged to Miguel's memory, and she wanted to honor it in solitude. She pulled out a wooden box she kept on the highest shelf of her closet. Miguel's possessions that had been returned to the family after his death. A university ID card showing his bright smile. Acceptance letters to graduate programs he would never attend. Letters he had written to friends describing his dreams for Colombia's future. At the bottom lay the thumb drive containing the video footage of the massacre he had witnessed, evidence that Blackwood had refused to review. For the first time in 15 years, Maria allowed herself to truly grieve, not just for Miguel's death, but for the man he might have become, the contributions he might have made, the family he might have raised. Her tears came freely now, washing away the rigid control she had maintained throughout her long pursuit of justice. Meanwhile, in a federal holding cell downtown, Harrison Blackwood sat on a narrow bench, staring at the concrete wall. The expensive suit that had symbolized his authority now felt like a costume, marking him as an imposter who had finally been unmasked. His attorney had already informed him that the evidence against him was overwhelming. The FBI had been building their case methodically, using Maria's initial tip to uncover a web of corruption spanning decades. The $50,000 from Cordero Industries was just the beginning. Investigators had discovered a pattern of payments linked to immigration decisions, criminal sentencing, and even custody rulings in family court. Blackwood's offshore accounts contained nearly $2 million in bribes, each payment carefully documented and traced back to specific cases. His wife had already filed for divorce, his children were refusing his calls, and his golf partners were deleting his contact information. The prestigious country club had revoked his membership, and the charity boards he had served on were scrubbing his name from their websites. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from respected pillar of the community to pariah. But it was the memory of Miguel Santos that haunted him most. Throughout the night, Blackwood found himself recalling details of that long-ago hearing that he had tried to forget. The young man's earnest face, his sister's careful translations, the desperation in their voices as they pleaded for protection. He remembered feeling annoyed by their emotion, viewing their fear as weakness rather than recognizing it as a cry for help. The FBI investigation revealed that Miguel's video evidence had indeed been compelling. The footage showed uniformed men executing civilians while Cordero Industries' security chief directed the operation. Miguel had risked everything to document these crimes, believing that American justice would protect him if he brought the truth to light. Instead, he had found Blackwood, a judge who valued money more than human life. 3 days after the arrest, Maria received a call from Agent Chen. "Dr. Santos, we need your testimony for the grand jury proceedings. Are you prepared to go through the details again?" "As many times as necessary," Maria replied without hesitation. "Miguel deserves to have his story told completely and accurately." The grand jury hearings revealed the full scope of Blackwood's corruption. 17 families came forward with evidence of cases where asylum seekers had been deported despite credible threats to their safety. 8 of those individuals had been killed within months of their return, their deaths directly linked to Blackwood's decisions. The corruption extended beyond immigration court. Criminal defendants who couldn't afford bribes had received harsher sentences than those whose families could pay. Child custody cases had been decided based on under-the-table payments rather than the best interests of the children. The wealthy and connected had purchased justice, while the poor and vulnerable had been systematically betrayed. Maria testified for 6 hours, her translator's precision serving her well as she laid out the timeline of her investigation. She presented bank records, travel documents, recorded phone conversations, and testimony from other court personnel who had witnessed suspicious meetings in Blackwood's chambers. "Dr. Santos," the prosecutor asked, "what motivated you to pursue this investigation for 15 years? Maria looked directly at the grand jurors as she answered, "My brother believed in American justice. Even as he fled death threats in Colombia, he told me that America would protect him because Americans valued truth and fairness. When Judge Blackwood took money to send Miguel to his death, he didn't just kill my brother, he killed that faith in justice. I couldn't let that stand." The grand jury returned a 43-count indictment against Blackwood, including charges of bribery, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and what the prosecutor called judicial murder, a new legal theory arguing that his corrupt decisions had directly caused the deaths of deportees. When news of the indictment reached Miguel's village in Colombia, the entire community gathered for a memorial service they had been unable to hold 15 years earlier. Maria's elderly parents, who had never been able to afford the trip to America, appeared via video call to thank the families who had supported their daughter's quest for justice. Miguel's death was not meaningless, his father said through tears. His sister made sure his voice was finally heard, not just for our family, but for all the families who suffered under this corrupt man. The trial of Harrison Blackwood became one of the most closely watched judicial proceedings in decades. Legal scholars debated whether a sitting judge could be held criminally liable for decisions made from the bench, while immigration advocates used the case to highlight systematic problems in the asylum process. Maria testified on the first day of trial, her calm professionalism a stark contrast to Blackwood's obvious distress. As she described Miguel's final days, his hope that American justice would save him, his terror when the deportation order came through, his last phone call promising to prove his innocence if given more time, several jurors openly wept. "The defendant asked me to translate a lie," Maria concluded her testimony. "But I'm here to translate the truth, that my brother died because Judge Blackwood valued $50,000 more than a human life." Blackwood's defense team tried to argue that judicial immunity protected their client from criminal prosecution, but the judge presiding over the trial, Judge Patricia Martinez, who had known some of Blackwood's victims personally, rejected that argument. "Judicial immunity protects judges making good faith decisions based on law and evidence," Judge Martinez ruled. "It does not protect criminals wearing judicial robes who sell their verdicts to the highest bidder." The trial lasted 6 weeks, with testimony from FBI agents, banking experts, other judges who had noticed Blackwood's suspicious patterns, and most powerfully from the families of his victims. Each story followed a similar pattern: Asylum seekers with strong cases who were denied protection after Blackwood received payments from interests in their home countries. Maria attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where Blackwood could see her. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the courtroom, and she would see not the arrogant judge who had destroyed her family, but a broken man finally facing the consequences of his choices. On the final day of testimony, Blackwood's attorney made one last attempt to humanize his client. "Your Honor, Judge Blackwood served this country for 30 years. One mistake, one moment of weakness, should not define an entire career." Judge Martinez's response was swift and unforgiving. 17 people are dead because of the defendant's moment of weakness. 30 years of service does not excuse 30 years of corruption. This court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. As the guilty verdict was read, Maria felt Miguel's presence beside her for the first time since his death. Not the tortured spirit she had carried for 15 years, but the peaceful soul of a brother who could finally rest knowing that justice had been served. Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that shocked the legal community but sent a clear message that corruption in the judiciary would not be tolerated. As he was led away in shackles, he turned one last time to look at Maria. "I'm sorry," he mouthed silently. Maria nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement that the debt had finally been paid. After the trial, Maria returned to her work as a translator, but with a new mission. She established the Miguel Santos Foundation, providing legal assistance to asylum seekers and training programs for translators working in immigration court. The foundation's motto, printed in 17 languages, read, "Truth needs no translation." Years later, when law students would ask Maria how she had found the strength to pursue justice for so long, she would show them Miguel's photograph and say simply, "Love is patient, love is persistent, and love always finds a way to speak the truth, no matter how long it takes or what language it must use." Judge Harrison Blackwood died in prison 7 years after his conviction, his name synonymous with judicial corruption. But Miguel Santos lived on in every asylum seeker who found protection, every translator who chose accuracy over convenience, and every sister who refused to let injustice have the final word. The truth, as Maria had learned, was indeed the same in every language, and sometimes it just needed the right translator to set it free. Maria Santos walked out of the courthouse for the final time, Miguel's photograph tucked safely in her briefcase alongside her translator's certification. The scales of justice had finally balanced, 15 years after her brother's voice was silenced. As she stood on the courthouse steps, a young asylum seeker approached her, speaking rapid Spanish about his upcoming hearing. Maria smiled and offered to help, knowing that Miguel's legacy would live on in every truth she helped translate, every voice she helped the courts to hear. Justice, she had learned, was a language that transcended borders, and sometimes it just needed the right person to speak it clearly.